For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. In 1992, renowned forensic toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova shocked the world by declaring she found cocaine and nicotine in Egyptian mummies. The results surprised everyone because we believed that tobacco and cocaine were available only in the Americas up until the Age of Discovery in the late 15th century. The mummies, dubbed the cocaine mummies, caused a stir in the world of history and archaeology because some were eager to point out a previously unknown trade link between Egypt and the Americas. Is it possible that ancient Egypt somehow obtained cocaine and tobacco from the Americas? Are there any other plausible explanations for intoxicants in Egyptian mummies? Let's find out. Hi, I'm David Miano. I'm a scholar of ancient history and a teacher by trade, and on this channel I'll do my best to give you the straight facts on what we know about the ancient past, without appealing to fanciful tales, science fiction, or conspiracies. Today, I want to share with you what I found out about the cocaine mummies. In 1992, Svetlana Balabanova and Wolfgang Pirsig from the University of Ulm and Franz Parsche from the Institute for Anthropology and Human Genetics in Munich published a short article in the journal Naturwissenschaften, revealing the findings of their tests on ancient Egyptian mummies. They also wrote a letter to the Lancet to summarize what they discovered. Their research examined hair from one complete ancient Egyptian adult female, a priestess by the name of Henut Tawi, one incomplete adult male, and 7 adult mummified heads, all dating between 1070 and 395 BCE. Why would they examine their hair? Well, during hair's growth and keratinization, certain chemicals, including drugs, are absorbed by the hair. These chemicals can later be recovered for analysis. Hair analysis is able to provide long-term information, even years later, about the individual's drug exposure. The tests carried out by Balabanova and her team were done using GCMS, that's gas chromatography mass spectrometry, and radioimmunoassay. Both methods are standard procedures for drug tests used in legal cases. In the ancient Egyptian mummies, the researchers found traces of cocaine, nicotine, and hashish. Parsche and Andreas Nerlich published a follow-up in Fresenius Journal of Analytical Chemistry in 1994, and another in Virchow's Archiv in 1995 with a full discussion of the Henut Tawi mummy. They stated that nicotine, cocaine, and THC and or their metabolites were present in her hair, skin, bone, tendon, liver, lung, stomach, and intestines, and the cocaine concentrations were highest in the stomach, which they attributed to ingestion. The story made a splash in 1996 when a documentary titled The Mystery of the Cocaine Mummies appeared. Here's how Balabanova describes the reaction to her findings.
I got a pile of letters that were almost threatening, insulting letters saying that all this was nonsense, that I was fantasizing, that it was quite impossible because it was proven that before Columbus these plants were not found anywhere in the world apart from America.
These kinds of stories are red meat for alternative history proponents because they like to believe that good science very often can't move forward because of interference by the powers that be, who don't want history to be changed. I've not seen these letters that Balabanova describes as almost threatening, and I don't know who wrote them, or even if they come from higher-ups. But it does not surprise me that people would be incredulous about her conclusions, and that they would think she made a mistake. As far as I can tell, no harm came to Balabanova or her career. Perhaps a bit of drama here for the TV program, huh? It's probably a good idea if I give you a little background on nicotine and cocaine and where they come from. The evidence Balabanova, Pirsig, and Parsche presented was chemical evidence, which concerns the identification of active ingredients or metabolites of plants in human organic tissues, hair, bones, etc. Nicotine is an alkaloid, an active ingredient of tobacco. Benzoylecgonine is a cocaine metabolite. Nicotine and its metabolite cotinine, as well as cocaine, had been already detected in the hair of South American mummies. The oldest archaeological evidence for tobacco use goes back to 1500 BCE in North America and is related to the species Nicotiana quadrivalvis. It was later displaced by Nicotiana rustica from South America. The oldest archaeological evidence for cocaine is from coca leaves found on the floor of a house which was dated to 6000 to 5800 BCE. Because balls of slaked lime were also found there, and this is associated with the consumption of coca leaves, this shows that the practice of using both together was already occurring. Cocaine comes from the Erythroxylum plant genus. While there are over 300 species, the ones known to be cultivated for cocaine are Erythroxylum coca, which was and is the most widespread, and to a lesser extent Erythroxylum novagranatense and Erythroxylum ule, all native to South America. Residents of ancient Peru chewed coca leaves as a stimulant and appetite suppressant. The human body can process cocaine from coca leaves naturally, giving the consumers a high and allowing them to perform hard labor for long durations. The Inca colonized much of Peru trying to control the coca trade. The first coca plants reached Europe in 1569. The Spanish physician Nicolas Monardes of Seville described their use as follows: that from early morning until evening, the Indian is continually chewing the sun-dried coca leaves in the mouth without consuming the same. This is partly done for pleasure addiction, but also partly to suppress hunger and thirst and sustain their enormous efforts, especially in traveling. In order to prevent the dry leaves from being crushed too quickly between the teeth, they are mixed with ashes and quicklime, which is obtained from conchylian shells, then placed into the mouth in the form of beads. So naturally, we might conclude that the Egyptian mummies tested by Balabanova and her team had access to these plants. And since these plants are found only in the Americas, then somehow the ancient Egyptians of the first millennium BCE obtained these plants. I'm currently working on a course about ancient exploration, and I'm very interested in the question of whether any ancient people from the old world discovered the Americas. I think it would be really fascinating if they did. I have found no Egyptian records of contact with the Americas, so I've been looking up all the evidence I can find for any contact between the old world and the new during antiquity. It would have been difficult for the ancients to have crossed the Atlantic, but not impossible. Most of the evidence I have found is fairly sketchy. A connection between the Americas and Africa is a popular topic among fringe theorists who claim the step pyramids of Mesoamerica were built by the ancient Egyptians, or there was some kind of connection between the two. But they ignore the evidence that they were built thousands of years after the Egyptian pyramids, look very different, and had completely different purposes. Many of the claimants find it hard to believe indigenous people of the Americas could have constructed magnificent pyramids, but I don't. Some pseudo-anthropologists have even claimed Africans built the pre-Maya Olmec civilization because some Olmec statues have supposedly African facial features, but they also show great similarity to the appearances of people living in the region today, and they're indigenous. We have to be honest. Similarities in art are not sufficient to demonstrate a link, especially when the similarities are superficial. Perhaps more significantly, in 1982, an American treasure hunter named Robert Marks, after receiving a tip from a diver, found several Roman amphorae, jars, in the Guanabara Bay of Brazil. The area is often called the Bay of Jars. If there was no long-distance trade between the Americas and Egypt, how did they get there? Since no others have been found, I think the most we could conclude is that a Roman galley lost its way and drifted to the Americas. But there is reason to doubt the evidence. Marx wanted to continue his search for a Roman shipwreck, but he claimed that the Brazilian Navy had prevented him from uncovering any more artifacts by dumping boatloads of silt in Guanabara Bay, instigating a ban on diving in the area, and prohibiting Marx from re-entering Brazil. Brazil vehemently denied ever dumping any silt in Guanabara Bay. They said the reason behind its ban was because Marx was suspected of removing Brazilian artifacts, like gold coins, from the country and selling them at auction for his own personal profit. Marx avoided answering any questions from journalists about this. And then a Brazilian businessman, Americo Santarelli, claimed that he had made the amphorae in Portugal and submerged them in the bay in 1961 so that they could achieve an authentic barnacled look. He said he waited for many years and then was only able to retrieve 4 of them before Marx discovered the rest. So this evidence for ancient transatlantic trade doesn't seem to hold up. The ancient Egyptian watercraft were geared mainly towards traversing the Nile River, and although they had ships that could travel the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, they preferred to hug the coasts rather than travel out into open sea. They relied on others, such as the Phoenicians, who were better at sailing, to undertake open sea travel for them. Let's play the devil's advocate and assume a long-distance two-way trade existed between Egyptians and the Americas. I find it odd that the Egyptians who wrote in detail about their many other expeditions, such as the land of Punt during the reign of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, do not mention a word about trade with such a far-off land. It was in their character to boast about such things. Moreover, the Egyptian trading mission from Punt, believed to be a kingdom in the Horn of Africa, returned with exotic animals, frankincense, and myrrh trees. The Egyptians loved writing about the commodities they received from other countries. Why are there no records of what Egyptians imported from the Americas? Why are there no depictions in their art? If cocaine's anesthetic properties or ability to provide a boost for workers were known to the Egyptians, wouldn't it be mentioned in at least one text? Or if cocaine was used for the mummification process, shouldn't we find cocaine in more mummies? Now, mind you, it is possible that they did write about this and that such records simply have not survived. But it would be nice to find corroborating evidence. Another question to ask about a possible trade between Egypt and the Americas is, why would Egyptians only import cocaine and tobacco? Surely the Egyptians would have valued the agricultural produce of the Americas. Maize, chilies, tomatoes, cacao, and potatoes, which have become staples in our daily lives, should have flooded the old world. Another thing to think about is whether the Egyptians simply would have purchased the coca leaves from the people of South America, or would have purchased the plants themselves and then replanted them in Egypt, developing their own crops. If the product was in demand, it seems likely they would have opted for the latter. Cut out the middleman, as they say. But why is such a crop not listed in any of the documents of the Egyptians that mention their crops? Why is it not depicted in any of their tombs, which are full of agricultural scenes? We do not have any evidence of any crop from the Americas existing in Africa, Europe, or Asia at this time, genetic evidence included. This makes the idea of a long-distance trade where vast quantities of goods were exchanged between Egypt and the Americas seem improbable to me. Additionally, there is a difference between the level of cocaine found in the Egyptian mummies and the level of cocaine found in Peruvian mummies. This suggests, at the very least, that the Egyptian use of cocaine differed significantly from the Peruvian use of cocaine. Let's look at the comparison of the values between different mummies tested by Dr. Balabanova's team in 1992 and 3. If you look at the table, you will find there is a major difference in the cocaine levels between the Peruvian mummies and the Egyptian mummies. The levels in the Andean mummies would be closer to a person who regularly consumed coca leaves as a part of their dietary staple. This is a red flag. If the Egyptians adopted Peruvian custom, shouldn't the values be comparable? To put these numbers in context, the cutoff for a positive result for cocaine in hair samples is 0.5 nanograms per milligram, which is 500 nanograms per gram. The level of cocaine in the Egyptian mummies was found to be between 24 and 200 nanograms per gram. As you can see, the levels in the mummies tested by Balabanova wouldn't meet the criterion for a positive cocaine test. But the later study of Parsha and Nerlich found a cocaine level of 646 nanograms per gram, plus or minus 112, in the female mummy's stomach, and this would be considered a positive test, though not by much. So far, only the female mummy has tested positive for cocaine, and no one has replicated the results because no one else has been granted access to the mummy. So let's consider other possible explanations for the findings to see if there are any that are more probable than that the Egyptians traded with America. One possible explanation is that the Egyptians got access to plants containing nicotine and cocaine from somewhere else, somewhere closer. We cannot say from documentary evidence that they were able to obtain nicotine or cocaine from somewhere else. But even the scientists who tested the mummies acknowledge that this is a possibility. In 2003, Duncan Edlin interviewed Svetlana Balabanova and Wolfgang Persig, and when he asked them if there may have been plant sources available to the Egyptians, Balabanova replied, "It is known that cocaine is the principal alkaloid of the leaves of Erythroxylum coca. Cocaine is present also in other Erythroxylum species native to South Africa, Madagascar, and Mauritius in amounts less than those found in Erythroxylum coca. However, it is possible that in antiquity, a way to concentrate cocaine was known." Professor Michael Montaigne reported that South American shamans concentrated nicotine routinely into a thick black syrup. Moreover, it is also possible that in ancient Egypt, plants containing cocaine were present. And when asked if ancient Egyptian traders could have obtained any such plants from elsewhere in Africa, the Mediterranean, or the Middle East, Parsig replied, "Yes, possible, but not proven. Some plants could be imported from Asia." When I looked into this, I found that there is strong evidence that nicotine was obtainable in the Old World. Nicotiana africana is a plant native to Africa, and it has concentrations of nicotine up to 2%. Perhaps an even more likely source was an abundant pollen of the Anthemidae family, which includes the genera Metricaria, Anthemis, and Chrysanthemum. These can be found in abundance in Egypt. It turns out that the pulverized flower heads of the plant were used to make an aromatic oil of chamomile that the Egyptians employed in the mummification process. This could very well explain some of the nicotine, but not fully, because nicotine has sometimes been found in the body cavities of mummies, and the oil was not applied there. But there are 23 dietary sources of nicotine in addition to tobacco, out of which 2 plants, Withania somnifera and Apium graveolens, were known to the Egyptians, with Apium graveolens being the scientific name for celery, commonly used as food. While sources of nicotine are known to exist in areas the Egyptians definitely had access to, this is not the case with cocaine. The many species of the Erythroxylum are spread over 4 continents, with the largest center of development in the Amazon basin and Madagascar. The ones found in Africa and Asia seem to be related to the ones in Madagascar. But while clearly these species are related to each other, only the ones in America have been found to contain cocaine. And believe me, I dug deep to look at every test taken of the species found in Africa and Madagascar. No cocaine in them. So, if there was cocaine in the Old World, we would have to suppose that it came from a plant that is now extinct. When asked if this was a possibility, Parsig said, "Yes, the destruction of nature today is the best evidence, and nature had been destroyed also in ancient times." And Balabanova said, "It is possible that plants containing the alkaloids were present and used in ancient Egypt." But while the suggestion that a now extinct plant containing cocaine was used by the Egyptians is within the realm of possibility, the evidence for it is lacking. So let's look at some other possibilities. Did anything threaten the accuracy of the tests? I found no reason to doubt the researchers themselves. When she tested the mummies, Dr. Balabanova was considered one of the leading forensic experts in the world. She pioneered several testing techniques which are used in criminal investigations. her testing methods have a strong acceptance in the scientific community. Though many scholars criticized her conclusions, there is a consensus that her experimental procedures were sound. What else should we consider? Despite what some people may tell you, scientific test results, in order for them to really mean anything, need to be expertly interpreted. Interpretation includes double-checking to make sure no extenuating circumstances affected the test results.
I think there were two ideas which sprang immediately to mind. One was that possibly something in the tests could give a false result. And the second was that possibly the mummies that had been tested were not truly ancient Egyptian, that they could be some of these false, relatively modern mummies, and so the traces of cocaine could be in those individuals.
During the 19th century, there was a thriving trade of fake mummies in Egypt. Because of the interest in Egyptology, unscrupulous dealers often took recent corpses and embalmed them to resemble mummies. These often included partial body parts, such as the head or the limbs of the mummy. So the possibility that fake mummies were tested instead of real ones needed to be investigated.
So the only way for Rosalie David to check out her theory about fakes was to travel to Munich to see for herself the 7 mummies that were the cause of all the fuss. The Munich mummies, as they are known, belong to the city's Egyptian Museum, which is housed in the old palace of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, who started the collection. Inside the museum, Rosalie David found the sarcophagus of Henot Tawi, the Lady of the Two Lands. She discovered from the museum catalogue that the coffin was bought by King Ludwig from an English traveller called Dodwell in 1845. There was no record of an exact excavation, but Henot Tawi was said to come from a tomb reserved for the priests and priestesses of the god Amun in Thebes. But while being shown the other coffins, Rosalie David discovered that apart from Henot Tawi, most of the Munich mummies are of unknown origin, and some of the tested mummies turned out to be only detached heads. According to the museum, research had revealed inscriptions, amulets, and complex embalming methods which they claimed proved the mummies were ancient.
The investigation shows clearly that the Munich mummies are real Egyptian mummies, no fakes, no modern mummies. They come from ancient Egypt.
The obvious way to prove this was to show the mummies to Rosalie David. But all the museum would let her see were empty sarcophagi.
On grounds of religious respects, we don't show the mummies here in our galleries. That's one point. And the other is that we don't allow to film the mummies and to show them on TV.
I'm trying to figure out why Balabanova and her team were allowed to test the mummies, but David was not allowed, out of religious respect for the mummies. I understand why they may not want them on TV, but surely she could have been permitted to examine them off camera. But David seems to have given them the benefit of the doubt.
From the documentation and the research which has been carried out on the Munich mummies, it seems evident that they are probably genuine because they have packages of the viscera inside them, some with wax images of the gods on them, and also the state of mummification itself is very good. I would say that the detached heads we can't comment on, but the complete bodies probably are genuine.
So, David considers the whole mummies to be genuine. The next thing was for her to try to replicate Balabanova's findings on other mummies to see if any others tested positive for cocaine.
Skeptical of Balabanova's results, Rosalie David decided to get some samples from her own mummies and have them tested, especially for equinox.
They're so tightly fixed to the... What we're going to do is to provide tissue samples and a hair sample from a number of mummies in the Manchester Museum collection. I should be very surprised to find that they had cocaine in them. We've received results back from the tests on our mummy tissue samples, and 2 of the tissue samples and the 1 hair sample both have evidence of nicotine in them. And I'm really very surprised at this.
The results of the tests on the Manchester mummies have made me very happy. After all these years of being accused of producing false results, contaminated results, and things like that. So I was delighted to hear that nicotine was found in these mummies, and very, very happy to have this enormous confirmation of my work.
The spin that Balabanova puts on it is interesting. She says that the discovery of nicotine in the Manchester mummies is a confirmation of her work. And it is true to a point. But the real question was whether the mummies would have cocaine, and they tested negative. To date, barring the Balabanova mummies, we haven't found cocaine in any other Egyptian mummy samples. The lack of replication of the results is a matter of concern in concluding definitively that the Egyptians consumed cocaine. Before tests such as this are conducted, it is customary to trace the object's chain of custody from sample collection right through to analysis. This ensures the validity of the sample and of the testing process, so as to remove any doubt about the results. With something like a mummy, this would be starting from the finding of the mummy at the archaeological site and where it traveled from there. Sometimes this is very difficult to even know, particularly with mummies that were found a long time ago. And the reason for this is so that it can be ascertained whether the mummy's various environments have had an effect on the mummy. This brings us to our last possibility, and that is contamination. External contamination is a real threat in scientific testing. I refer to the entry of chemicals from the environment into the hair or tissues of a person after their death. In his assessment of the situation, Mark Kearney of University College London writes, "For such an important conclusion, her, Balabanova's, data treatment is lacking, but more worrying is the utter lack of context in her work. In the 3 scientific fields I mentioned above, context is king. This is because we are not dealing with fresh, newly made samples. At a minimum, samples could be a few days old and likely highly contaminated by their surroundings. Contamination is something that can easily happen over the course of 3,500 years from either poor storage conditions, poor handling, or even cross-contamination with another object. Learning about where to sample from archaeological or artistic objects is one of the fundamental skills you are taught when entering the field. This means without proper provenance or records, all results, no matter how good the analysis was conducted, need to be taken with a very large pinch of salt." Not many people consider the posthumous biographies of the mummies. Spillage, leaching, vermin, and insects eating into the remains, contamination during transportation. The possibilities are endless. According to some scholars, the organic material in the mummy and the contaminants undergo a process known as diagenesis. Compounds that were present degrade because of fermentation, oxidation, and cross-reaction with other compounds, forming new compounds that were not present during the mummification process. These compounds, in turn, could cause a false positive test result. It's not only what happened to the mummy after it was found that could be a cause of contamination. What about what happened to it in ancient Egyptian times, such as when the embalmers mummified the body? As Balabanova herself said, "The influence of environmental factors on the substances deposed in the different body tissues post-mortem has not yet been clarified. Ambient moisture, decomposition processes, and embalming practice may play a role. We have demonstrated that in artificially mummified bodies from ancient Egypt, the nicotine concentrations were significantly higher than those found in the naturally mummified bodies. This indicates that the alkaloid was possibly used post-mortem at the embalming procedure. In addition, in the artificially mummified bodies, the levels of cotinine, the first nicotine metabolite, were also lower than those measured in naturally mummified bodies. This indicated that nicotine was used ante-mortem and metabolized to cotinine." We should keep in mind we do not know the exact details of the Egyptian mummification process and all the chemicals used to embalm the bodies, so there are many open questions. Parsig admits, the people used drugs by inhaling or chewing before they were mummified, but I cannot exclude the additional invasion of some drugs into the skin of the deceased during the mummification process via some drug containing oil or ointment. We only have sparse information on the mummification process. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, only mentioned some details of the mummification techniques, which were poor in Herodotus' time compared to the techniques and quality of mummification performed thousands of years earlier. Nevertheless, they did add that because the drug was found inside the hair, they think it more likely that it comes from the lifetime of the person. In 1976, the mummified remains of Ramses II were taken to Paris to be repaired. A botanist working on the team, Dr. Michel Lescaut, discovered within the bandages the remains of a plant, tobacco. Not merely nicotine, but tobacco. More was found on the pharaoh's abdomen.
I prepared the slides, I put them under the microscope, and what did I see? Tobacco. I said to myself, that's just not possible, I must be dreaming. The Egyptians didn't have tobacco. It was brought from South America at the time of Christopher Columbus. I looked again, and I tried to get a better view, and I thought, well, it's only a first analysis. I worked feverishly and I forgot to have lunch that day, but I kept getting the same result.
In the time of Ramses, we have evidence for the existence of tobacco only in the Americas. How could this be? One theory is that this is a recent contamination. Smoking among archaeologists and historians in the 19th and most of the 20th century was fairly common. It was banned in museums quite recently. The researchers could have handled the mummies while smoking. But researchers testing the levels of nicotine in Egyptian mummies suggest a cutoff of 2 nanograms per milligram in the hair samples to distinguish between passive exposure to smoking and regular consumption of tobacco products. Some of the Egyptian samples are over 2 nanograms per milligram, while others are below it. While we can perhaps say the samples which were below 2 nanograms per milligram were contaminated, how do we explain the ones above 2 nanograms per milligram? There is another possible source. Mummies are susceptible to insect and mite infestation. When Ramses II's mummy was examined, evidence was found that insects had infested it, specifically single larval exuviae of the dermastids, Dermestes frisci and Thylodrius contractus, an adult beetle of Lasioderma sericorne, and the mite Tyrophagus. The first 2 have been found in other mummies as well, but the third one, Lasioderma sericorne, is interesting because it is commonly known as the tobacco beetle. It has been found in museum collections as well. Now, before you misunderstand me, I'm not going to suggest that the tobacco beetle is the source of the nicotine. No. The beetle is called that because it is attracted to tobacco. The tobacco was already there on the mummy, and the beetle detected it. What I am actually going to say is because mummies are liable to infestation, both in modern times and ancient times, insecticides were rubbed on them to help keep off the bugs. One 19th century technique involves washing the mummy in a mixture of tobacco leaves and a strong lye prior to application of a mercury insecticide. This was probably done to Ramses' mummy at that time, and this is the most likely explanation of why traces of tobacco were found on it. Because the Bella Bonova mummies have been around for a long time, a similar explanation to account for the nicotine makes sense. But how do we explain cocaine in the mummies? There are insecticidal qualities of cocaine, but evidence for its use as an insecticide on mummies is lacking. Still, it is reasonable to think it could be a modern contaminant. From what I understand, the mummies were once privately owned by the King of Bavaria. We don't know what habits the king had or those who worked in his household, but at that time, cocaine was a fashionable and legally acquired stimulant. Much of what I have just shared with you is not contained in the documentary. Mind you, some of it has come from the years after it was released, but listen to this summary at the end.
The tale of Henot Taui shows that in science, facts can be rejected if they don't fit with our beliefs, while what is believed proven may actually be uncertain. Little wonder, then, that a story that began with one scientist, a few mummies, and some routine tests, in no time at all could upset whole areas of knowledge we thought we could take for granted.
Note how the writers take it as a given, not only that the test results on the mummies are facts, but also the interpretation that the chemicals must have originated from substances acquired in the Americas. And further, it uses these assumptions to make a statement about how some people can't handle the truth. But I have to ask you, even if you think the Egyptians acquired cocaine from the Americas, do you think this conclusion is necessitated by the findings? And do you think that the only reason why someone would disagree with this conclusion is because it doesn't fit with their beliefs? To be clear, I do think we humans have a tendency to hold on to our existing beliefs in the face of new evidence, and I think this tendency should be fought. But I don't think we should jump to conclusions either. If the test results are correct, and we cannot really know for sure unless the mummies are allowed to be retested, then we would be remiss not to consider other possible explanations. These mummies had long posthumous biographies, much of which is inadequately accounted for. Simply taking the test results without giving any consideration to the post-excavation conservation history of the mummies would be turning a blind eye to important factors affecting the test results. Context is important for all scientific experiments. It seems to me that the evidence for the use of insecticides containing nicotine is the probable explanation for the nicotine in the mummies. The evidence for the widespread use of cocaine in ancient Egypt or a transcontinental trade with the Americas is weak. Hence, the most reasonable conclusion for the cocaine mummies is that the samples were contaminated and the experiments yielded a false positive. The lack of cocaine in other samples from the same region further calls into question the result being an anomaly. Further, the significant disparity in the concentrations of cocaine between the Egyptian and the Peruvian mummies raises doubts about regular cocaine consumption among Egyptians. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you really liked it, a super thanks. As always, if you want to help support this channel, consider becoming a patron. You can do that at patreon.com/World of Antiquity. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.